listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, Ange, and I welcome you to episode number 11. Today's podcast focuses on artificial intelligence, AI, and mental health. We are thrilled to have our guest, Jim, here to share his experience in the field. Some of the topics mentioned in this episode include the impact of artificial intelligence on the workforce, its use in disease identification and treatment, meditation, music, sleep tracking, potential uses in clinical research, therapy settings, and bias reductions. We also discuss some risks that pertain to privacy and concerns over job loss to AI. If you feel triggered, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee and let's get started. So, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, well, listeners, I am really excited to have a repeat guest on the podcast. Jim Schwebel was on episode number 2, where he shared the story of a family member impacted by mental health and the story about his brother and what he endured through that journey, what lessons he learned. And that's a phenomenal episode. So I hope that all the listeners, when you listen to this episode, rewind and go back to episode 2 and listen to the rest of Jim's story. We're both really stoked about today because we're going to get a little nerdy on the science side. Both Jim and I are nerdy engineers. And so I'm really excited for him to talk about some AI in the mental health space. So now I'm going to pause and shut up. And Jim, why don't you just kick us off? Tell us about yourself. Tell us why you're here today and why you're passionate about it.
Hey everyone, I'm Jim, currently an engineering manager at Verily. My views do not reflect Verily, just noting that. It's my own. I am an engineering manager by interest and at heart a CEO. I've started a company, I've sold it before in the mental health space. I also would say that I'm a husband to my wife here in Boston, also a great friend, and I talked about my brother historically, and I have a lot of roles in my life, both in family and in industry. I'm very excited to talk about mental health and its role in the coming age of artificial intelligence. I think there's a lot of pressures put on workers nowadays, and I see it at work in other places as well, where we're increasingly needing to produce more with fewer people and getting things done. Our productivity is going up. We're using new tools like OpenAI and ChatGPT. And how does that make you feel in your job? I think all these are new questions, new frontiers for how we work, how we operate. Creates a whole series of ethical questions. Also, didn't mention I am a musician, compose music, and I've also created a wholly generated, machine-generated artificial intelligent album recently. So I've seen that in my own life as a musician with my friend Burke. So we can cover a lot of topics, but I think this all affects mental health. Very passionate about translating knowledge into the world in that area, given my brother has recently passed away due to some of these things and died recently. But I also think there's a lot of hope going forward, not only with these technologies, but also I think they're liberating if used in the right way. And I can speak to that in my own personal life.
Which topic should we dig into first then? Which area are you thinking, Jim? I want to make sure we absolutely cover this area of AI. Why don't you just jump into one of them and tell us a little bit about your thoughts, the pros, the cons, the benefits, where you think it's going?
So we could dig into one area which I think is very pressing in the world. I think right now we're seeing in Los Angeles a lot of writers going on strike many people in the world that are very stressed out about the coming age of artificial intelligence and what it means for their career. It means that there's probably a lot of stress build up, and we all know that stress causes prolonged stress, causes anxiety, which can lead to more depression and a lot of mental health comorbidities. But financial stress and going on strike for a cause is a big thing we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of this throughout the world, and we're seeing it happen in a lot of jobs where ChatGPT and related technologies can happen. So I guess starting like in this area, I guess we can have a conversation. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about these tools and unions and workers mobilizing to address concerns around pay gap, inequity, and ultimately how it could affect mental health? Because if your work could be replicated by an artificially intelligent entity, say write a whole movie script in a day that maybe not be of great quality, but is a good starting point, which makes you needing to write 10 more scripts to be more productive with low wage. How does that affect your mental health? I mean, these are open questions. I mean, Angela, are you using AI in any way that you feel like you need to be more productive? I guess would be a question.
Yes. So I've had mixed feelings about AI. So when I first really heard a lot of people digging into it, I am on the board to the president of Georgia Tech. And in one of our meetings, we spent an entire board meeting talking about AI and in the future. And this idea of, is AI going to replace human beings? And in what way will it replace human beings? And it was amazing, the conversations, even to the point of, we had the head of the admissions office at Georgia Tech. And I always make these disclaimers at the end, but I'll also follow Jim here. I'm not speaking for Georgia Tech or anything of that. I'm just talking about my own personal experience, my own memory. So I'm not speaking for anything anyone specifically said that you should write down, and it's something that needs to be published as a manuscript or argue or debate. So the conversation came up from the president and the head of the admissions. Should we just get rid of the requirement to write an essay as part of your application to Georgia Tech because of ChatGPT? And the head of the department said, no, because all we see is it somewhat leveling the playing field across individuals. And so for centuries or decades, you've had individuals who come from a certain class that can afford to have a tutor help them write their essays for colleges, and they have that. And then you have the individuals who don't have those means, don't have those resources, and they're writing the essays all by themselves, okay? And so the stance that the admissions department had was, if you've used, which I've used and played around with ChatGPT, as well as some other AI things that I love, what you put in and what you get out still needs to have that human connection, so you have the logic and those other components of it. And so their stance was, all we're doing is providing resources across the board to everyone. The end of the day, one phrase that was repeated over and over is that AI will not replace humans. Humans who learn how to use AI will replace those who don't step up to learn how to use it. And not replace it, but they'll be the ones that are going to be able to advance. And they reflected back a lot on the times when, for example, the calculator was invented. And you went from doing things longhand, and then suddenly you had a calculator. And Jim, I think when you and I both grew up, we had people telling us, you're not going to have a calculator around all the time. And yet we do. We have a calculator on our phone all the time now. But
Yeah.
all that did back in the day, they're like, oh, this is so awful. You're going to have this and it's going to replace all these things. All it did was allow so much more growth in other areas when it's tied into. And so that mindset of, so for example, in Georgia Tech, a lot of the conversation has been in freshman classes or as required classes, regardless of the major, having courses, not just on AI, but on the ethical use of AI and how it ties into ethics. And so I'm really looking forward to see what those syllabi end up looking like in those classes, about how we're frameworking the use of technology as well as the ethical use of it. Now, the challenge you mentioned is in the writer's strike. and that component of it. And that is a tough one. I actually have a friend, I'm a member of Chief, and one of the C-suite ladies in Chief is in that industry, and they're really struggling with this whole situation that's happening. And I don't know the answer to it, because I think that if we can figure out how to use it and bring all of the resources together, it can be something phenomenal. And yet, if we don't, or we don't figure out that pay inequality, which has been a challenge in every industry, and I think it's come to the forefront, and it's probably time in many of these industries to address it and to look at it and try and think as the next step forward. But it is a challenge. I will say my own personal use of AI. I have a couple of AI things that I've become really obsessed with. One is a meditation AI app that I started using. I heard about it on another podcast that I listened to, and it was really cool because you can go in and you can write what's the topic that you want, and it asks you to be as explicit as possible. So I went in and I said, I was really stressed. It was a morning meditation. I was going to go into work. I already knew I was overbooked in the office. I would have a gazillion emails. I would have conflicting priorities. And I wanted a meditation that focused on stress reduction. So I typed all of that in and then pressed create meditation. And this magical visualization of this individual climbing a mountain that's your work day and picking up a backpack full of rocks, and you hike a little bit and you take out a rock, and one of the rocks is emails, and it walked you through this, and it was a very healing, calming perspective of it that I thought for AI would be phenomenal. The other AI that I use in my life is a journaling app. I know the science behind why journaling is really helpful for your mental health, and yet I'm horrible at it. And so I found another app via the same podcast. It's a journaling one, and it asks you questions, and I go in and put the answers, and then it formulates this story out of it that I look back, and it's almost healing reading it, because I say, wow, yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. And I couldn't put the words into it, but it was in that scenario, in both of those scenarios, it's not just the AI doing the job, it's me putting the valuable input into it for it to be able to do its job. So that's kind of what my experience is. What about you?
I think that I like to write a lot of software. I used to write libraries over a year or 6 months that I can now write in a weekend. I can write 30,000 lines of code in a weekend. In some ways, that's liberating. In some ways, it's stressful. With increases in your productivity, it gives you the idea that you can do things with yourself and only a few people that would previously have taken hundreds of people. It opens up a whole new window of creating, which for me is really interesting. Even as a musician, I think it was really exciting creating an album in a day, generating art and media that provided me a lot of purpose. I think from an individual perspective, when you're able to tailor these large language models to your own life, it's a choice on whether you view it as a threat or meaningful. And I think that alters how you perceive. And I think it matters a lot how you choose to perceive. I imagine if you're a writer, it's a lot more stressful because your existential being is threatened, as in your income could be taken away or reduced if you don't adapt, to your points earlier. But I think there's a lot of hope, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn how to use these tools. And I also think that people with a lot of creativity have an advantage, and a lot of neurotypical people versus people that are very creative. My brother had schizophrenia. I wish he were still alive today, because these tools, he'd be incredibly empowered and probably would be one of the most high functioning people in the world. And I kind of wanted to project a little element of hope for anyone struggling, because I feel like these types of tools can normalize yourself to the world. And I also say this for people struggling with Alzheimer's. I had a conversation this week with a researcher, and what if you could take people who have dementia with memory deficits that were on phone calls like this, ingest this through a machine learning algorithm, recombine it in a way that fixed dementia in a way on the other side and could communicate as if you're normal through some transfer learning mechanism. I think there's ways to think about these new experiences and degradation that provide hope and meaning, and also deeper connection. And I think that there's a lot of perspectives we can go and choices we can make to try to make that reality manifest. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm just saying these are we're at the very early stages of possibility. And to me, that's really, really exciting. And I think on the flip side, that's the pro. On the flip side, there is the world where you can create 100 versions of yourself and clone your consciousness, and each one of those consciousness are versions of yourself and replicate it, and it can cause a lot of confusion. And are you authentic if you're cloning your own mind? And I think authenticity is questioned. Like if you're messaging somebody back ChatGPT as context and they don't know it's not you, there's a interpretation and human element to inauthenticity. We're just learning how that is propagating into the world, and I think there's misuse possible. So there's both sides, but I choose the optimist side, and I think in building these models myself, I think we all have a responsibility to try to use these in an ethical way and test the limits, but also at the same time try to improve mankind with these technologies, which I think we're all trying to do, but it's hard when profit motives are at stake at the scale of Microsoft or OpenAI and these other companies.
So true. I'm thinking, I love the conversation you just said about the dementia component of it, because I was trying to think of some use cases in the mental health space and looking at, for let's take example, the journaling app. One of the things I love about the journaling app is I struggle trying to convey what I'm really thinking. And so it is so comforting to me to type something in and then have an output that comes and I say, wow, that's what I was trying to say. I just couldn't figure out the words to it. And so I was thinking of a use case for an app in a therapy or a therapeutic session where you could have an instance where you're trying to convey something to your therapist, and maybe you say it and the AI hears it and repeats it back. And then you say, no, that's not what I meant. And it does a cycle. Let me repeat it a different way and so it's really this collaborative thing. Like, let's figure out together what we're trying to say. Kind of the same thing from the therapist, the things therapist saying to you, and he or she may say something and it not register to you. However, if it was said slightly different, or if there was a way for an AI that knew your personality type that said, okay, I know Ange receives things this way. So the therapist said this, let me repeat it this way. And so here suddenly I get the value add of this customized personality type in it that ties to my personality, which of course only works if I'm authentic and giving it feedback, which I think is the other thing, how you can't completely replace things. In theory, you can't completely replace things because that feedback of the human nature and saying, yes, this is along the right lines and we're doing this, or no, this is not what that was meant, is so valuable. But thinking about that use case, and also the use case of then bringing in a family member who has a very different personality and utilizing AI to try and describe a disease state and say, describe it this way. Okay, now describe it this way. And then that family member having the opportunity to hear it a couple different ways such that they actually understand it, which I think is the core of healing and mental health, is communities understanding each other. And that is so, so incredibly hard, especially like the busier we get, the more stressed we get, the diverse our populations are. So if there's something that can pull in those pieces and create a communication style that can bring people together, I see a lot of value of that in the mental health space.
No, I agree. And I think of when my brother was in full-blown psychotic episodes, humans can't have empathy. So machines can have infinite patience and empathy. And I think there are moments where humans are incapable of empathy after continual interaction with psychosis for that long. It's just too hard. It's too hard to be present for 4 hours without sleep or ability to communicate. And so I think there's a lot of areas like that where you'll see the ability to provide care or empathy in ways that don't currently exist. I also wonder when you can go from co-pilot, as in journaling together with an app and making it something really interesting, to autopilot, as in completely cloning your mind in the cloud, the implications of that, both for mental health and for work. Because when you leave your job, you could put on autopilot and still get all your job done and then come back in harmony with the autopilot. And you never went on a PTO. I think that's a different mentality than PTO. And I think we're going to start having these patterns now where productivity is always on no matter what, because we can clone your consciousness in subtle ways. And so that creates a different kind of feeling of work, it could create a lot more stress. And I think we need to talk more about that. It could be like I'm coming back and I'm really stressed and I have to get caught up on my autopilot. And now I have to like catch up on my autopilot. And why don't I just keep my autopilot on 24/7 and never work? And I think those are like questions we all have to address probably in the next few years.
Definitely ties to the ethical components of it. And now that you say that, one of the things I'm thinking about in the mental health space and PHI and confidentiality, and some individuals, you and I have been vocal about our challenges and our family, our history. So much of the world can pull up a podcast and learn all about things that Ange has experienced in her life. And I've made that decision to do that. There are other individuals who are really want to be very private, and they want to hold maybe their childhood trauma stories. They want to be able to convey that in a therapist. They don't want it to necessarily be out in the cloud. So how do you think there could be barriers or some type of protective mechanism in that way, such that you, by buying in, also put yourself at risk of having all of your biggest secrets, most intimate moments right on the tip of your fingers? And I'm a big believer, quite frankly, that they're already there in places. And so this isn't really making that much of a difference, but I'm 100% confident of being wrong and would love to hear what your thought and perspective is.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. Who should you trust and why should you trust them is something that's very personal to every person. I don't think anyone should have a prescriptive answer there. You should be allowed to trust and not trust whoever based on your history in life, and that's perfectly fine. Right? I can say for myself, there are a lot of things you can extract from a voice file that could infringe on privacy. For example, your age, your gender, common things. Also, beyond all that, 4 levels deep, like your psychosis risk, your dementia risk, your Parkinson risk for tremor with vocal signatures of the throat, the risk for respiratory disease and illness, progression, all the way down to subtyping types of dementia, from frontal temporal dementia to Alzheimer's to pre-dementia. And I think all these have correlates, and not all of it's perfect. It even is things like molecular mechanisms like testosterone. You could, from the frequency of your voice, approximate the level of testosterone in your bloodstream, which can implicate a lot of diseases when you think about the correlation of testosterone to estrogen and all the cascades of chemicals to testosterone. If there's a zero point 0.9 correlated value to a chemical in the body, there's probably downstream diseases you can predict from that. Not saying we've done any of that science. I'm just giving the frame by which privacy can be infringed just from recording a conversation. And I don't think we have a lot of precedent, and I don't think there's a lot of ethical considerations here that have been discussed until there's abuse. And I think we have historically abused these things in hiring and other places just through the racist and sexist things that have happened in our world over the years. For example, you can tell from somebody's voice probably what ethnicity they are a lot of times, or their gender. And sometimes that affects choices implicitly and how we choose to decide or rate people. Not saying that's happening at my work at all. I'm just saying that's persisted over the years in our society. And so I think as humans, we have a lot of these implicit biases, and how we go about correcting them and how we go about thinking about them and how we go about acknowledging them really matters, and having equity. And so, yeah, I don't really know. And so I could see a lot of the trust issues that exist in the world. And I don't really know who you should trust with your data, when you should trust your data. I think it depends on your whether in the United States or Europe with GDPR. Can I delete my data is a good question. If you can, that's probably good. So when I go online, I usually VPN in Europe, so that I am a European citizen. So I abide by European law as opposed to US law. And there's a lot of things around my privacy that I control like that, but not everyone knows that. And so I feel like these are sorts of things that you get, it doubles in the detail. And I think it matters. And every country's different, every state's different, every employer is different. I could say that employer sponsored systems like Lyra Health and the way they do medical consulting probably is more privacy centric because it's compliance necessary for enterprise partnerships in a certain way, and you can opt out. And then maybe in other places you can't. And so I hope we can come together and align on standards so that we know how to judge and trust our medical information with third parties in a way that it helps us. That's my hope. I don't know if we're there yet. I think we are. We're getting closer. I think most of the clinical trials that are ongoing are going in the right direction. And I do think collecting data is probably better than not collecting data because it will help more people if we do more clinical trials. Just in the case of my brother, schizophrenia and genomics was an area that I think could have really helped them if we had the right genomic data sets and we got the right treatment response and we had the right drugs that to administer on his subtype. Problem is a lot of psychiatrists we talk to weren't looking at MRI images or genomic profiles and the depth and level we need probably to treat him appropriately and get rid of all of his positive hallucinations. And so it's challenging. It's challenging to get the right treatment. There's a lot of recurrence.
Absolutely. One of the things that I keyed into when you were talking about the identification of various personal properties based on voice. And I was thinking episode 7 was on gender identity challenges and mental health. And Rainbow, who's transgender, she shares her story about how when she calls a lot of places, because her voice still sounds very masculine, then a lot of individuals will say sir, and she's like, I wish people would just stop saying ma'am and sir at this point, especially on the phone. And so I'm thinking about even just having the ability to maybe take a step back. And I'm hoping that maybe even as we grow as a society in understanding gender challenges and trying to make progress in those, that maybe we can also make progress in some of the stigmas or some of the generalizations that are made based on what you perceive of one's sex, one's gender, one's race, and how AI actually could have a big impact in that, because it could take the conglomerate of the information and output a repeatable response, when we know there are so many studies that show in the past, they used to do these studies about, if I submit my resume, it's the same as yours, and mine says Angela at the top of it, and yours says Jim at the top of it, you're more likely to get the job than when I am, because I'm a female and you're a male. And that's been going on for decades. And yet you could see in an instance where an AI mechanism could be used to remove those biases. And I think those inherent biases that we have, even in when you're talking about AI can have unlimited empathy that a therapist or someone else could have, right? Another component of it is we as human beings have our own biases based on our own lived experiences. And so I may hear the story of some individual who struggled and suffered, and I'm inputting my own experiences into what their story is, and I'm making this master story in my head, which could or could not be accurate. And you could see an instance where an AI could instead remove those inherent biases and even just work as this mitigation tool within it to say, wait, Angela, you just responded this way. I'm seeing your biases come out. Why don't you think of a different way to talk to the individual that doesn't have your biases? So some of that coaching, maybe even executive coaching in a lot of areas, utilizing AIs that can see those repeatable trends in individuals and the impact it has on other individuals in those conversations, I think would be fascinating. My perspective is much to what you said. I would rather give more of my information and more of my data, because I have a finite time to live on this planet. And if something from my information and my data can be combined with somebody else's to help improve the quality of life of someone in a future generation, then I'm going to do that. I'm just going to be willing to do that because I just think so much value is added in there. But I do understand individuals who've had challenges and don't want that. And so that's, a big risk for them.
Yeah, informed consent is very important in any clinical trial and study. And I think we should have a choice. I think the one thing that I agree on probably is that we should have a choice. The choice should not be made for us. And I think that's part of what freedom is. And so I hope we get to that point where we can opt out or choose. Be that if we can never choose. Choosing to participate is worth it because there's so many things that we can do to solve certain things or to help others just in combining data sets. I think that there's new incentives that could happen with that. For example, if you're a pharma company and you're recruiting a patient, there's capitated models of paying participants an upside of a drug that could lead to benefiting all parties and not just the pharma shareholders. Those are new models that I would love to see innovated by more companies. I understand the motives and reasons not to. I think that these are the sorts of things that decentralized movements and communities can really shape, have a voice in. And things like crowdfunding companies is something that I've been really interested recently. Are there abilities to crowdfund companies in a way where everyone can benefit in stock in a startup that's trying to solve something like a rare disease that could lead to helping lots of people? I do think that's something to consider when you consent data, because it is worth something. Make sure you know that. The other side of it for me, just in the voice field, is imagine you're conversing here, we're speaking in English. There are models now that can take an English model and translate to any language in real time, called a speech-to-speech model. You can literally converse now to people in different countries in their native tongue, fluidly speak to them in conversation. And to me, that's kind of remarkable, that removing the cultural barrier to connect. And I think that is really powerful when you think about the mental health community, because there's a lot of people who struggle in America that are moving from Mexico or moving from, Europe, China, and many other places, and they don't have many people that speak the same language in their community. And if there's a way to like unblock that barrier, that's huge to feel connected. And so I like to look to the hope, because I feel like a lot of the things we're doing, both in clinical research and elsewhere, are English centric and usually white male dominated in terms of recruitment profile. But I think that when you start creating these accessible patterns, can get more participation in trials, going back to empathy and participation. So yeah, it can come full circle to connect to the conversation.
Well, absolutely. And in the informed consent world, I run a biotech company right now. We're running a clinical trial in the pancreatic cancer space. My whole career has, for the most part, been in clinical research. And I remember at a period of my life when I ran clinical research at Emory University in the cardiovascular space, having some patients who you're, even with a translator, you're trying to describe to them what the clinical trial is and what the benefit is, and it's not the same. And in fact, there are many companies now moving more and more towards electronic informed consent. I'm a big believer that we need electronic informed consent that includes videos and visual aspects so the individuals can fully understand exactly what they're doing, because there's a big challenge. And we wonder why so many of the trials take so long to come to fruition and why they cost so much. And so much of it is challenges in recruitment. Individuals don't understand the value. They don't understand the rest. So they're afraid to participate in the clinical trial. Lost to follow-up, or individuals who, because that informed consent process was not done in a way to where they were really, truly informed and really understood, suddenly they get halfway through their treatments and they say, wait, I didn't know I had to have a blood draw every 6 weeks or something like that. So then they drop out of the study. Every time you have someone drop out of the study, now you have to backfill that, and the cost to healthcare and the cost to the individual. And I actually like to think about it as just the cost to the patients that are waiting to receive whatever the benefit of that treatment is so significant. So utilizing AI in a way to make informed consent truly informed is amazing. I mean, how many times do you go into somewhere and you're just given a stack of papers and all you do is look to where to sign and sign here, sign here, sign here, right? You don't really understand all of the pros and cons. So AI in a way to be able to convey that would be phenomenal.
Yeah, the models now not only in real time can translate the speech, they preserve your accent. So if you're German and you speak in German, you'll produce English that sounds German in your accent, which is sort of remarkable. And so there's extreme personalization, extreme ability to disrupt the way in which we deliver informed consent messages and care that isn't going through a third-party translator. There's not only that, I think that the other side of it too is simulation. If we can recruit robots into studies before we hit patients, we have an obligation to do that. And I think that this is where I tend to get into the world of theoretical simulation of clinical trials, but I think this is a new era, and there may be ways to use these LLM models to take surveys like we would for patient-recorded outcomes in certain ages and genders and demographics to get a lot of insight in silico before we do a trial, to see with a hypothesis that's rated on a simulation, things that we might not have intuited otherwise. And I think this is where it gets on the edge of what we know. We haven't really done a lot of this yet. But I feel like that to me is like an exciting future if we can de-risk assets before they're even hitting humans. These large transfer models, again, I don't know the risks yet here, and don't quote me on the possibilities. I just think these are things that would be useful to scientifically explore because there's minimal risk to humans. That to me is very interesting. Like in the voice era, for example, there's a lot of voice models where you can take surveys by a voice, specify the age, gender of the voice, and maybe one day you can screen for all these conditions like Alzheimer's or schizophrenia or these other symptomatic conditions in mental health throughout your life and know when it's good, bad, and get the right intervention just from your voice, but have like a clone of your voice that it's looking for to match to. So it knows, this is what you sound like when you're depressed. This is what you sound like when you have Alzheimer's. So once you hit that threshold, you get alerted. I think that's the type of thing that I think is really interesting with these text to audio models. So those are areas that I'm trying to explore outside of work and for research for fun.
I was just about to ask you that. So now I have three things to say. One thing, I find this so timely because just yesterday at my company, we had this conversation and it was it was a brainstorming session. So we said to everyone, if you had a magic wand and can prove something in clinical trials and the speed for clinical trials, the efficacy of clinical trials, what would you do? And one of the team members said, wouldn't it be phenomenal if there were more and more trials that the randomized component of it, the control arm, could be completely computer simulated on the control arm so that all participants who actually actively sign to participate are able to get the active treatment? Because a lot of individuals, we even in our trials have individuals who sign up and they get randomized in the control arm, and we struggle to keep them in the trial because they really wanted to be able to test the advance. And science and computer modeling and that can totally model what a control arm would look like in a randomized trial so that the active participant, the people who are signing up, are actually able to try the treatment and analyze it that way. So that was one topic that came up. The other thing that came to mind with informed consent, and even just in working in therapy, is the ability for an AI model to be able to identify when the individual is confused. And because a lot of individuals don't want to say, they feel as if it's vulnerable or they may look stupid or they don't want to say when they don't understand something. And so I believe a lot of challenges just in any area of healthcare, as a patient goes and they get a whole bunch of meds and they say, yes, I understand all of this. Well, an AI component would be able to register in their voice if they knew that individual's voice, if they really understood it or not, and be able to rephrase it in a way so that they understood it. And then a third thing, so now I have four things to say. The third thing I thought about was a challenge in the mental health community in different diagnoses. So I'm going to use bipolar as an example. Notorious for individuals who don't want to take their meds once they feel well. So if you had built into an AI app that reminded you of your meds, and then when you said you didn't want to take them or something, had this ability to have this coaching session with you or this ad hoc mini therapy session to remind you about why you should stay stable on your meds and have that in a way that can be perceived, there could be a lot of value in just medication. I can't think of the word. It's on the top of my head, but medication, actually following what your medication route would be in that area and not stopping medications when you shouldn't stop them. So the last thing I wanted to say, number 4, was what are some of your side projects? I know that you always have you have your full-time job and your life and your wife now and your dog, but what are some of your side projects that you're working on that you're passionate about?
Yeah, so I currently advise two companies. One is Synaptica Therapeutics. They're building an electromagnetic drug for Alzheimer's disease. They built a TMS therapy that targets an area of the brain called the precuneus with a specific protocol that Giacomo, the chief medical officer, and Emiliano Santornek, the lead scientists, have created that has very strong response to treating the disorder early. And so they're very interested in that area because it's a non-invasive electromagnetic stimulation approach to treat Alzheimer's and dementia and related conditions that has very little side effects, which is having the strength and power and effect of a drug. Most of the drugs approved for Alzheimer's right now, aducanumab, Biogen, and others, have had terrible side effects, and there are some that have fewer side effects. But the most notable side effects are things like brain bleed, stroke, and others, which make living post those very, very difficult. So excited about this area, and I'm very excited that they have a phase 2 trial and paper published that replicate their results, and encourage anyone that's excited about that area to go to their website and read more, because they're doing some amazing work. And the other area is in quantum computing, a company called QSecure. They're building a next generation encryption method for the internet and any IoT device using quantum-based encryption. There's a lot of new threats out there related to encryption being broken by sufficiently powered quantum computers through brute force search, like Grover's algorithm, using just simple algorithms like Grover's algorithm and other algorithms. They've built a quantum resilient offering called QProtect to help secure endpoints and infrastructure that are critical. And a lot of their customers are government customers initially, because the government has passed a lot of acts around quantum computing that mandate quantum-based encryption. And it's currently being standardized right now, quantum encryption with NIST standards. The Kyber algorithm has been selected as a leading candidate algorithm out of NIST. So very deep. I'm going too deep on this podcast for that, but I'm very excited about quantum computing, its role in encryption, and specifically its role, how it can help protect our privacy and encrypting our data. So yeah, and then larger to that, there aren't that many people that know quantum computing. It's a new field. We have a critical shortage of talent in quantum computing. I'm co-directing a new community called the Q Force with Rebecca Krothamer, who's a part of QSecure, to help train more people to write code on quantum computers. So if that's an area of interest, please go there. It's a need. There isn't a lot of academic programming, even in undergrad or graduate school, for quantum computing. And so that's kind of a thing that I think is worthwhile to devote my time to, just because it's quantum computers in the world. We need more people to be employed and use them, and we've a critical shortage of talent. So most of my time's there, and I code a lot for fun, and I do a lot of side projects in voice, and I open source a lot of code, but I think those are mostly where I spend my time.
I love that. And just thinking, we've talked a lot about just privacy and security. So understanding that mechanism of it and how it can also tie into the other topics we discussed earlier is pretty awesome. So tell me, Jim, a couple of things. One, I like to hear some of the guest favorite motivational quotes. I'm a big believer in motivational quotes, and what you say to yourself over and over ends up playing such a big impact in your life. So I would love to hear what some of your favorite motivational quotes are. And then finally, I would love to hear, what are some things that you, Jim, do on a personal note to take care of your own personal mental health?
Famous motivational quote for me, and it's been since my childhood, is the Steve Jobs graduation speech that he gave at Stanford, and he has, it's like, your time is limited. Don't spend your time wasting living someone else's life. That phrase really resonates with me. Everyone has their own journey. Everyone has their own set of ways they can contribute to the world. I think we carve out these roles for people that might not fit everybody's nature. And there's a constant struggle between your nature and your environment. and having that belief that you can be yourself in any environment if you choose to be. And it's just coming to acceptance, but everything else he said in that speech, I resonate with, but that one specifically. And then what are the other questions? Sorry, I was like narrowing in on that.
No, that's great. I do want to make a comment to listeners. I will ask Jim to send me several of the links of the companies that he's mentioned. I will also post the link to the quote as well as that graduation speech, which is phenomenal. I will post all of these in the show notes, so make sure you follow those. So the second question that I asked Jim was, what tools, what mechanisms, what routines do you use in your personal life to maintain your own personal mental health?
Well, this is a good one. So anyone who's married or is in a significant relationship has to consider being in as a team member, a team. And so my wife and I actually go on date night every Thursday, and that's been great because we look forward to it every week. And that helps us disconnect. And we all have very stressful lives. My wife's a pediatric oncologist, and I'm a busy manager at work, and our schedules are pretty busy. But when we have that dedicated time every week, it kind of disconnects us in a way that's very, I think, pleasant. So that's one. We walk our dog every night as well. Every day we go out for a family walk, which is pretty awesome, assuming the weather is good usually. The other things that I do a lot of creating, make music. I write poetry. I've done illustration albums to cope with my own grief, but I do a lot of reflection, and I often manifest it in creative outlets. I wouldn't say that's ritualistic in a form of a weekly thing. I'm more listening to my mind, and at moments I feel like I need to create, and so I tend to get lost in thought in those moments. To do that. I think just knowing when is the right time is important because not every time is important. Yeah, and I guess those are the main things that I'm really busy. Some days I wake up at 7 a.m. and have meetings till like 8 p.m. So it can be kind of crazy. Other days it's a little less busy, but at least having consistency and like things like date night for us, and also having like a good healthy habit every day to have meaningful time with our dog, or wind down after work, or have like some of these dedicated pieces of time to meditate or make art for me has been very useful. Conversations like this with friends also are to me very useful because you tend to reflect on things and get into topics that you don't usually talk about, and it's to me really great, to release that and to share it with others. So
I completely agree. I completely agree. I love that. And I've started nighttime walks with my service dog, Harley Quinn, and it's so therapeutic. I am obsessed right now with improving my quality of sleep. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. Matt Walker has a phenomenal podcast. Andrew Huberman has a phenomenal podcast. And I have been going through them, pulling out the ones that deal with sleep and trying to master different sleep routines and different things that I want to do. I'm a tech nerd as well. So I like all the trackers. I believe in looking at trends and not isolated numbers. So I can really tell after doing this a period of time, I can tell when I've done this behavior and I see my sleep score in these couple of apps and I see, oh, yep, it's totally dropped. And I knew that was going to be dropped because I didn't follow that routine that was really helpful to me. So I love some of those things. Do you have, Jim, any parting words? Is there anything that you thought, wow, I really wanted to make sure the listeners heard today before we end the session? I really hope you'll be a future guest and we can find another nerdy science topic to talk about because that really makes my day. Is there anything even in the world of AI that you're thinking of, or in another topic you really want to make sure the listeners hear?
I think that a lot of us are trying to determine what AI means for everybody and yourself, your friends, your family members, your children. I think we're all kind of going through that together as a human family. And so I encourage more people to talk about it. I think we all have a responsibility to kind of pull each other up and try to not feel like it's a bad thing all the time. I mean, just feel like if you feel like your job is at risk, it's going to stress you out. But there's lots of other people going through that, like writer strike, for example. And I think that's an important thing to reemphasize. I think we should try to create the right structures to cope, either through psychotherapy or peer communities, which are equally as powerful. And I think that's something I hope we all can start doing more of. And as a manager, I think a lot about that. There is a lot of uncertainty, but I think we all should feel a responsibility to be in it together, because I think all of us are trying to figure out, what do I do? What is my job? How do I think about my job? How do I think about meaning and purpose? And there's no good answer, but I can say that we all are as a human family going through that. So it's good to acknowledge that and try to validate that.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. I know you are super busy, and so we are really grateful for you to take this time out and have this conversation with us today.
Awesome. Thanks, Ange. Really appreciate it.
You just listened to episode 11 featuring our guest, Jim. We enjoyed some nerdy conversations about artificial intelligence, AI, and mental health. Some of the topics mentioned in this episode include the impact of artificial intelligence on the workforce, its use in disease identification and treatment, meditation, sleep tracking, potential uses in clinical research, therapy settings, and bias reductions. We also discuss some risks that pertain to privacy and concerns over job loss to AI. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host's and guest's own personal stories and do not represent the opinions of any organization, company, or treatment center mentioned. RAND is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocate.network.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocate.network.org. In case you're wondering, every individual working with RAND does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds raised go to support the mission. So don't forget to love, not like our podcast, and subscribe. We have quite a few amazing guests booked for future episodes. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. So subscribe today and share it with your friends. The more you do so, the more likely we will show up when others who need to hear the story are looking for the message. We hope you will also connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read blog posts, stay in the loop about upcoming events, including our next fundraising auction being held on October 26th through the 28th of this year. In a previous auction, I was the lucky bid winner of Foreigner VIP tickets. Thanks, Foreigner, for supporting RAND's mission. This was so healing for me because when I was younger as a child and experiencing abuse, I would often hide in my bedroom and listen to music, and Foreigner and some of those songs were comforting to me at that moment. So it was very healing on Thursday of this week for me to experience them live in concert in their farewell tour. So thank you, Foreigner, for supporting RAND. If you would like a sneak peek into some available items, contact donate@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. If you would like to donate items or services, then email us. Make sure you follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at RAND to Wellness. If you wish to provide feedback, please feel free to leave comments on the episode or email us. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the U.S., dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation. Now, back to your coffee.